something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. Today I'm speaking with sociology professor Peter Phillips about his illuminating new book, Titans of Capital: How Concentrated Wealth Threatens Humanity. You can read my assessment of the book if you buy it. I was inordinately happy when I saw that this was on the back cover. I wrote, "If you want to know who is running the world on behalf of the global oligarchy of wealth, read Titans of Capital." To help Peter promote his important book, I've decided to make this episode available to everyone. Devil's Chess Club is part of the American Exception podcast. If you appreciate the deep analysis and forensic historiography that we provide here, and if you want to have access to what I believe to be the best podcast collection of deep political and historical analysis, please subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. A link is in the show notes. If you can afford it, please subscribe, because with more subscribers, we can do more things. So please do subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. I'm really excited and happy today to have Professor Peter Phillips here with us to talk about his new book, Titans of Capital: How Concentrated Wealth Threatens Humanity. Peter Phillips, how are you doing today?
Great, Aaron. It's good to see you.
Yeah, we haven't seen each other in a while. I came to a few conferences out there in the Bay Area, and saw you virtually when you were on my dissertation committee. So it has been a little while, and I want to talk about your book here, Titans of Capital. I should probably get a better version of this slideshow. Here we go. So this is the new book, and it's a follow-up to your last book, Giants. Can you explain a little bit about Giants, and then how you came to write this follow-up, Titans, which is really excellent, which I really recommend. But maybe you can give the backstory of the first book and then how you came to write this book.
Well, Giants we were concerned, this was 5 years ago, with the concentration of capital and how it was being managed in the world. And we were seeing emerging these capital investment companies that would accept millions, billions of dollars from rich people mostly, and reinvest it somewhere. And they were expected to get a return of 7, 8, 9%, something like that. And so there's ones like BlackRock and Vanguard and Fidelity, UBS, State Street. These companies, I call them giants because they had $1 trillion worth of investment capital, which seems like a lot of money then. I mean, now they've doubled it, but back then, $1 trillion was 1,000 billions, and the whole pile of free floating money that they could invest anywhere they wanted. And there were 17 companies in the world that had $1 trillion of money to invest, capital investment money. And so I called them the Giants, and that was the name of the book. And they collectively held $41 trillion worth of wealth. To make a long story short, now there are 31 giants. They collectively manage $83 trillion worth of wealth. And so 31 is probably too many to do a good sociological analysis. So I just looked at the top 10. And the top 10, many were the same as the giants historically. But now just those 10 control $50 trillion. more than double what they had less than 5 years ago. So these big companies, BlackRock, Vanguard, UBS in Switzerland, Fidelity, State Street, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan Chase, Amundi in France, and Allianz in Germany, and Capital Group here in the US, those 10, they control $50 trillion worth of investment capital. That's money, cash. And they're managed by 117 individuals, 2/3 men, 1/3 women, and mostly white European and American people. There's 16 people of color. There's actually 21 nations represented, but most nations only have like one person, Mexico and Lebanon, and have one person in those groups. So these 17 people are the board of directors of the top 10 capital investment companies. Not only are they a small group of people, but they're all interinvested in each other. So all 10 of those companies are cross-invested to the tune of $320 billion, meaning that they're watching each other, they're watching their investments, they're watching capital growth, and they have a general desire collectively to see capital continue to grow and expand. So they're kind of locked into this. They want to get a return annually, and so they're representing the 0.5% of the wealthiest people in the world, 40 million people. And these are the multi-millionaires and billionaires. There's 2,600 billionaires. And when they take their excess capital and they turn it over to one of these companies for investment practices. So the West has this huge amount of capital that's been growing and expanding. And it is considered by governments and intelligence agencies the vital interests of the country. I mean, when they talk about special interests, that's what they mean. And that's, protecting capital is a reason, and protecting capital investment worldwide is a reason we have military bases everywhere in the world. And so this is the core of capitalism. And it's an accumulation of money at the same time among the top 0.5%, and at the same time a diminishing of wealth for the rest of us, particularly the bottom half of people in the world. So, and there's these dire consequences. 20,000 people a day are dying from lack of nutrition and easily curable diseases. So there's, a death consequence of this capital concentration. And that is wealth in the world that I strongly believe needs to be shared more openly and have a humanitarian agenda of keeping people safe, fed, and healthy. It should be a priority of humankind. And that's not happening. And then one of the reasons it's not happening is because of this concentration of wealth. So in the book, I identify the 117 people by name, by what company they're with, what other companies they manage. Almost all of them are one or two other boards. In fact, collectively, the 117 people are 131 boards of directors of big corporations. Those 133 corporations have a collective annual income of greater than the GDP of all the nations in the world except the US, China, and Japan. So this concentration of wealth, not only is it concentrated among the capital investment companies, but then they in turn are also on the boards of directors of these other 133 companies, which is this huge, a mega amount of money that they're controlling. So concentrated wealth is one of the key issues in the world today. And it's certainly that wealth concentrated has doubled in the past 5 years. It's increasingly more concentrated, and it has negative consequences. I spend chapters, looking at where they're invested. So they invest in tobacco, over $100 billion, and that's killing 8 million people a year. Cigarette smoke and tobacco. They invest in alcohol for $60 billion, and just in the U.S., there's 20 million alcoholics who drink 74 drinks a week, and they're buying half of the booze. So of all the alcohol sold in the country, 20 million people, the alcoholics, are consuming half of it. So a major part of capital gain from alcohol sales is due to alcoholism. And of course, tobacco addiction. And they also invest in plastics, which are incredibly dangerous. But the two worst are $400 billion invested in the oil companies. They fund continued growth of the oil companies. So the Titans are directly involved there. We know that global warming is happening. We had the most highest temperature this year in 2024 ever in history. And so they're not, and it's not being reversed. We know that we need to quit using so much oil and gas, but they keep growing and expanding because they have this capital that they continue to invest, and they're going to continue to try to get a return on it. So big negative and then I think the most dangerous consequence of capital investment is the war industry. They got $200 billion invested in the top 10 war manufacturing companies, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and the wealth concentrated there is directly related to war and the threat of war. So when Ukraine and Russia engaged in a war, we saw a 10 to 20% increase in the value of stocks of those companies. So huge profits were made. And that's the danger to the world, is this concentrated of wealth and the areas in which it's, invested. And they invest heavily in gambling, they invest in private prisons. These are negative things in society that are continued to grow and be expanded. So the consequences of capital concentration are these negative investments, wealth inequality in the world, thousands of people dying from these consequences and dying just from straight starvation and lack of nutrition. And that's the state of the world today. And we call them Titans because the Titans were the Greek god myths of extreme power and control. And they have this. That's the picture, the image on the book is these two hands with these fish hooks in the world. And that's essentially what it is. And fish hooks are painful. So that image is deliberate.
Right. And in the West, we can, if we stand back and look soberly at it, we'll see that this has eroded whatever kind of cultural, moral impediments there were to this sort of top-down rule by money and the privileging of money over any societal issues. I mean, over the well-being of society. And just a couple of things that you were talking about, alcohol and gambling. Just in recent decades, they have removed the restrictions that there used to be on things like advertising alcohol and hard liquor on television. Now you can encourage people to buy whiskey. It's not that social scientists discovered that alcohol really wasn't that bad for you, and so there was no reason to not allow them to advertise. It's just that the money logic is so unassailable now that previous institutions that were designed to sort of curtail some of the more negative effects of just pursuing any and every opportunity for money making, there's just nothing to stand in their way anymore. Gambling, additionally, is absurd. The gambling has taken over pro sports now. I mean, now when there's anytime that there's a crazy, controversial, and very decisive call, people automatically think it has something to do with gambling, and it's not unreasonable to think that, because they are advertising this on TV all the time. They're basically encouraging people to become compulsive gamblers. I mean, this is whatever things there were in the U.S. and in liberalism that used to act as a check on just unmitigated greed. Those are gone. And how do you see the titans of capital in these forces as what's their role in this political corruption that we see, social, societal, cultural corruption, even that we just accept that these things are there and that we know they're bad and we can't do anything about them?
It's somewhat invasive. It's the core of what capitalism is about. It's increasingly concentrated and controlled by smaller numbers of people with immense power in their ability to invest and have consequences for the world that are extremely negative. So that's, we can identify who they are, and we can target our requests for change to them directly. And I say the word request, which is polite, but I think these people need to be not only identified and announced, but clearly asked to make changes in the world and share this wealth. Just a few percent could eliminate global poverty. And it's kind of interesting because for a number of years, extreme poverty was declining in the world. And they like to say, oh, look, extreme poverty is declining, trickle down is working. We just have to keep growing and expanding. Everything's going to get better, which is not true, but that was their logic. And what we've found now, extreme poverty defined by the United Nations is living on $2.15 a day. And there's several hundred million people in extreme poverty in the world today. They're dying at accelerated rates and that, but it's a decrepit way to live. And that has increased in the past 5 years. The pandemic, of course, increased wealth concentration for the elites and declined it for everyone else. And but the only place in the world where extreme wealth declined was in China. I mean, not extreme wealth, but extreme poverty, inequality, extreme poverty. And China, they eliminated extreme poverty in China. They have a philosophy that they call Chao Chun, which basically means that they want to build a moderately prosperous society. And that's what the Chinese Communist Party's intent. And so now they have an active middle class. They have people that have cars and houses and families and go on vacations. And they still have, several hundred million people living on $5 a day, but they're not living in extreme poverty of $2.15 a day. That they eliminated. So, if the Chinese can do it, then certainly the West could do it. Quite simply. And that's something that I'm calling for in the book. And I think that by knowing who these people are, which is an important part of what the book is, we're able to say, stop this. We got to cease doing this.
Yes, and the people that you identify, these capital managers, what would you say is the relationship or how much overlap is there between these actual individuals and then the oligarchs themselves? Because increasingly, I think it's pretty obvious that what we have in the U.S. and as a supranational sort of system is an oligarchy. And in the U.S., this oligarchy pretends to be a democracy, but it can override laws and democracy if it so chooses. So it's really an oligarchy. The deep state is just another way of saying the oligarchic state, or this regime that we live under, which is not really operating by democratic or lawful logic. It's a different kind of a system. But what is the relationship between these 117 titans and the oligarchs that these titans seem to actually be the agents of?
Well, the titans are making decisions for the 50 trillion, where it's going to be invested, how it'll be invested, and what kind of speculation. And they've got more capital than they have safe investment opportunities. So that leads to speculative investments like the subprime mortgage fiasco. And it leads to investments in war, or encouraging war, or encouraging, saying that the threats of war are present. That just in the past 5 years, we've gone from half the people in the country being really afraid of China to 80% today say that they're fearful of China and that China is going to hurt us. And that's deliberate. So these are a propaganda machine that is anti-Chinese, anti-Russian, setting up that they make profits from. And that, so as we build more towards war and continue to grow and expand our military, and including our nuclear weapons, that wealth that is increasingly concentrated. These are the people making profits or investing the capital for the richest oligarchs in the world, and helping make those decisions. Now, these 117 people, they average about, one of them's worth 60 billion, but most of them are worth about 10 to 20 million. And they're basically elite working people.
Yeah. That
are deciding how to invest capital. And then most of them have managed major corporations themselves. Typically, they'll take a look at the number one titan would be Larry Fink. He's the CEO of BlackRock. And he came from a middle-class family. His mom worked for the state of California. His dad ran a business in L.A. He goes to work, he gets an MBA from UCLA, goes to work at First Boston, becomes a star in terms of investment decisions and making money for First Boston, gets an opportunity for Blackstone to start, they kind of fund BlackRock, and he gets to start that, and now is just listed this year as a billionaire. Forbes just said he's worth $1 billion, but he's on the Financial Services Roundtable. He's on the board of directors of the Museum of Modern Art. He's on the board of directors of the World Economic Forum. He goes to Davos every year. He's on their executive committee. He's on the Council of Foreign Relations. He's on NYU's board. I mean, so this guy worth $1 billion, has influence in a number of institutions, cultural and business, to set policy and directions in the world today. So he's probably more typical than most. He's certainly very important. But someone like James Gorman, who is the CEO of Morgan Stanley, he also used to work for Merrill Lynch, MSCI. He worked for Visa. He's on the Federal Reserve Board of the Bank of New York. He's a partner in the New York City Partnership Metropolitan Museum of Art. He's on the Business Council. He's on the Council of Foreign Relations. He's the World Economic Forum. He's on the Business Roundtable. He's an MBA out of Columbia. These people all have graduate degrees from top elite universities. And he's Australian, so he actually went to the University of Melbourne, where he got his BA degree. And he makes $10 million from Morgan Stanley, and he's got about 25 million in shares from Morgan Stanley. My third example is Judith Missick. She's on the Morgan Stanley board. She's also on the In-Q-Tel board, which is the CIA's technology foundation. She's past director of the Kissinger Associates. Kissinger, of course, died. but she was the CEO of Kissinger Associates. She worked at Barclays Bank. And she was the deputy director of intelligence for the CIA from 2005 to 2008. So she has a strong intelligence background. She's on the National Security Council. She's on the United Nations Association. She has an MA out of Denver, University of Denver, and she went to Pepperdine, and makes several $100,000 a year serving on boards of directors of Morgan Stanley, and she's also on General Motors board. So these are the people who are in these positions. They're in various policy councils. They have extensive backgrounds of policy formation making, and they're part. These are just 3 of the 117 individuals named in the book. I think it's very important that we know who these people are. And I think everyone in the country should send them a letter, care of their companies, and say, hey, it's time to share. You can make this happen. They could make this happen.
Right. And I mean, when you think about their role in influencing U.S. politics, it has contributed, I think, to the U.S. having changed really what its function is in the world, and what the function of the state is, what the function of the U.S. regime is, in that up to when the U.S. fights in World War II, they have to mobilize and organize society in kind of a sensible way, and also in a more egalitarian way than it had been previously. I think partly to legitimize a war effort that was ultimately about attaining hegemony over global capitalism. I mean, this was more or less what they planned. Even under Roosevelt and his progressive New Deal regime, they did plan out global dominance during that time period, and they went to pursue it. And the U.S. had a kind of a strong middle class then, and a strong industry, and was productive. And over time, it becomes increasingly financialized. And as you say, capital has less things to invest in, so they start cannibalizing the institutions that made America prosperous and somewhat democratic in some way, and more egalitarian in some ways. And now it seems they want to, and they have succeeded in taking over every aspect of society, or basically neutralizing it as any force that could work against the interests of money and act in a democratic way. I mean, it has become more totalitarian, and they want to turn everything into a toll road. They want to own telecommunications networks. They really fight anything being municipally or nationally owned in every respect. And it just everything is an avenue for rent seeking and profiteering. And then you compare this with China, where you had Xi coming out and saying, we must act to limit profiteering and rent seeking in education, healthcare, and housing. Right, but in the U.S., those sectors are all about rent seeking and profiteering, and it looks like, and you mentioned this in the book, but there's a lot of reason to think that China, because it has a more sensible set of policies, is going to be able to beat the West, because they're able to get more out of their population, because they don't try to stick it to their population in every way possible, whereas the U.S. absolutely does. So. Well, I guess how do you see the relationship between what China is doing constructively with its political economic system, and then what is the trajectory that the U.S. is on?
Well, they're diabolical opposites, actually. And but we're not supposed to think that. We're not supposed to believe that. You're not supposed to say anything positive about China. They're communist, totalitarian dictators that are, out to control the world. And if anything, they have been greater participants in Davos and the World Economic Forum. They've been stronger supporters of trying to, deal with global warming and some of the key issues that are happening and facing the world, let alone inequality in their own society. So the billionaires there, they allow billionaires to happen, and they have several hundred billionaires, almost as many as we have in the U.S., And but the difference is their billionaires don't have any say over the Communist Party at all. The Communist Party runs the show. They run the political apparatus. And the billionaires are at their regress. I mean, they're allowed to exist, but they don't have any major influences in terms of the party. Whereas in the U.S., both parties are controlled by rich folks and capital and investments that dominate our political process. So rich people run this country, and capital runs this country, and inequality is increasingly greater, and a lack of power and influence over that is increasingly more evident in the U.S. So there's really no comparison, and that's. I have a whole chapter on China in the book and a chapter on Russia. China they have some capital investment, but they have like $5 trillion of free flowing capital. They have some investment companies that manage capital, but it's like 5% of what the West has. And Russia doesn't really have anything. I mean, their GDP is below what it was 20 years ago. So they're extremely poor as a nation state, and they have wealth in terms of natural resources, but they're pretty much in dire straits, and the U.S. is making major efforts to undermine both China and Russia in terms of their economic status. And China, of course, is exceeding the U.S. in terms of income and capital growth. Russia is not, but Russia's danger, of course, is they're sitting on 4,000 nuclear weapons that they inherited from the Soviet Union. And they are a major danger to the world in terms of that capability. So the NATO organization and their advisory committee, the Atlantic Council, continues to make recommendations for a regime change in Russia and a regime change in China, and will do everything they can to try to make that happen. So when we set up the Ukraine for war, we engineered a coup there and put a government in place that was anti-Russia. And then the Russians in Ukraine and the southern part and Donbass and area and in Crimea were all ethnic Russians. They said, we're not going to go along with this. And so essentially a civil war was created that ultimately Russia came in on the side of the ethnic Russians in southern Ukraine and Crimea. And the CIA knew all along that Russia would never give up the Crimea. That's their major warm water port, besides in the Far East, where their navy is based, and they knew that they would never give that up. So that we were setting them up to be engaged in a long-term war, which the U.S. figured at the expense of the Ukrainians that they would pump a lot of money into it and try to bankrupt Russia due to that war situation.
Right, and that has, I mean, in the book you say that they've got Russia in an unwinnable war, but I don't think I think it's very winnable. I think Russia is actually in an unlosable war, because the only way that the West could reverse things would be to escalate in such a way that you would get nuclear doomsday. And it seems that reality has set in Washington just in recent weeks here. So I think some of these, I mean, it's hard to gauge these things all the time, but I think that's probably one.
It's meant to be a prolonged war that's costly to Russia.
And I don't know how much it can be prolonged now. I think that they miscalculated the effect that their sanctions would have, and they also miscalculated Obama figured it out pretty early. He said, we don't want to keep giving them these weapons because Russia has an escalatory advantage. That's essentially that was the case from the very beginning, that if whatever the U.S. or Ukraine would do to escalate, Russia could just go further because it's a core Russian interest. It's like putting missiles in Newfoundland or something. The U.S. would never have tolerated that kind of thing, and Russia wouldn't tolerate a NATO Ukraine. I mean, I don't know what the outcome is going to be, but it might be the end of NATO potentially, because just the way that things are going. I mean, this is why does Russia pose such this challenge to the Western system? Why can't, I mean, they're not communists, so why can't they be accommodated? I tend to think that it's like they have some actual sense of nationalism and sovereignty since Putin took over, and he's saddled with this oligarchy, but he's basically a nationalist, and that's not acceptable to these people.
The case, and they're a country with vast resources where capital could be have widespread investments in oil and gas and mining and timber. I mean, they have these huge resources, the largest country in the world, and the capitalists, the titans, are salivating over the possibility of a regime change that would allow capital growth in the Russian in Russia. So that is one of their agendas, is to bring back someone like Yeltsin, who would allow them to have capital investment.
Right, because Yeltsin was the person who let all these oligarchs essentially loot the country, more or less, right, who were backed by the West. And he handpicks Putin as his successor, but Putin ends up really going after a lot of these individuals, especially the most absurdly Western-aligned ones like Berezovsky and Khodorkovsky. And that represented, so he still has this oligarchy, but they seem to be less politically motivated. They seem to have to accept that they don't have the same political role that they did. And Russia also has, as I understand it, nationalized its armaments industry, which means that this war spending that has happened has been kind of managed in a more not in the way that the U.S. does. In World War II, corporations, oligarchs made huge amounts of money. I'm sure there's some corruption in the way that the Russian procurement system works for military stuff, but they do nationalize the biggest oil company.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and that
Chinese are the same way. So
yeah,
when the U.S. spends $1 on war implements, part of that is going to the profits of the war companies.
A huge part of it. Oh yeah, it's a very inefficient system, I think, because there's been nothing to stop it from being inefficient, because they just bribe Congress for all to create the laws that they want for military procurement. It makes you wonder, to what extent is the U.S. military a paper tiger? And sometimes these defeats in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, and Ukraine now, this suggests that it's not, everything is not as it seems in the West. So do you think that Russia do Russia and China, even though they have different ideologies, I mean, can we look at their participation in the West as being signs that they want to join this kind of a system? Or like China and Davos, for example, you speak about China and them being attendees in Davos, and there are some, especially right-wing conspiracists of a type, who think that basically a cabal of Illuminati controls the Chinese regime and the Western regimes. I mean, some even go as far as to argue that maybe what's happening in Gaza is just like a spectacle to bring in the New World Order or something, because they don't want to believe in Western imperialism. But to what extent could we say that their China and Russia participation in these things is due to a desire to sort of change the global system, or is it a sign that China actually approves of the rule of capital over the world? Because I think you could read these in different ways.
Well, Russia no longer participates in Davos. They were uninvited. The Russia House in Davos is now controlled by Ukraine. And so that was deliberate. The Chinese have increased their participation in the World Economic Forum. And they will, as the World Economic Forum is talking about global warming, and they are addressing some of these issues, and they're trying to say we want to have a better capitalism. So, you know, capital continue to grow, capital continue to expand, but they have to be more conscious of what they're doing in that process. And so, in a sense, it's somewhat an attempt to have corrective behavior, but it's not working.
Right.
And inequality is greater than ever. Wealth concentration is even more advanced. The dangers of war are increasing. Global warming is ongoing. So Davos is not successful in the sense it's going to reverse the major problems of the world. That's doesn't seem to be happening, which is one of the reasons I wrote Titan, is because we have to identify who the people are that are making this happen and stop them.
Yeah. I mean, can the West, well, what China and Russia are calling for, and this goes back to the 1990s, they've been calling for a multipolar world since about the mid-90s. They were, in foreign policy statements, they would say that we need to have a world where there is not one power who dictates, you know, how everything is going to be. In the U.S., we call it the liberal rules-based international order, but when you look at what it actually means, it's basically a global Führer principle. It's basically the U.S. makes all the rules and decides when it is allowed to break any of those rules. And if you don't like it, then then you're a threat to the rules-based order. I mean, can the West actually function if it were to act lawfully according to international law and according to the treaties it's signed, like the UN Charter and so on? I mean, because to me it seems the system is so predatory now that it's almost in a holding pattern of until this question is resolved about any international law and any rules at all that are rational or logical or fair. I mean, the U.S., it seems the West cannot play by the rules. It's always been imperialist for centuries, and it has never operated without acting in that sort of lawless, predatory way.
Well, it's confusing to me to think how these elites, how the titans, how these multi-billionaires can continue to support a system that is threatening humanity. Not only is global warming threatening all life on Earth, but certainly building more weapons and the potential of a nuclear holocaust is ever present. And to me, that is somewhat confusing. I mean, they have families and grandchildren and a life that they would like to have. I mean, some have built escape plans to go live on the ranch in Argentina or somewhere, but it's not, the world cannot continue to concentrate wealth and create this great inequality and have this massive death rate among the poorest people. I mean, half the world lives on less than $6 a day, and 80% of the world lives on $10 a day. So that inequality, it just can't continue without some major socio-political unrest that would be unstoppable.
Right, and you think about some oligarch or capital management person, and if they're thinking about their grandchildren, or you're imagining a grandson that you might not even have yet, or whatever, or a great grandson, and you want to think of them, playing little league games or walking in the woods or doing other things that humans do. But none of that makes any sense in especially with this nuclear issue. These things should be non-starters. We shouldn't it's not remotely sensible to do anything that has the risk of destroying the biosphere for all intents and purposes.
Right.
And yet what are they doing?
They're in a sense, they're trapped into the need for continued capital growth, and they look for ways to invest capital so that it will have opportunities to grow and expand. and they take seriously their fiduciary responsibilities to capital investors. Although I think that's less, they should be taking that less seriously and thinking more about the welfare of the world and human beings. But that's the inequality, and the consequences of what they're doing is extreme. And we must not only keep calling them out on this, but address this in very political, nonviolent, confrontational, whatever methods work. Creative methods are needed to challenge this inequality. And so I think that writing the book was my effort to at least say, okay, these are the people we've got to address. And they've got names and addresses, and let's start identifying them as part of the reason for all this global inequality and global warming in particular, and the threats to humankind in general. It really boils down to that kind of a threat. Will human beings continue to exist on this planet? And we could instantaneously be gone if a nuclear war happened. Yet we continue to build and expand weapons. I was living in Albuquerque just this past 3 years, and we moved back to California. But when we got to Albuquerque, there's a strong anti-nuclear movement there. There's a group called Vets for Peace that are very active, and I dedicated this book to them. And but the air base there in Albuquerque has 2,000 nuclear weapons in storage. And and I realized that I didn't know that until we got there, and that is the center of the nuclear weapons arsenal for the United States. Right there at Kirkland Air Force Base in Albuquerque. And it's like, oh my God, and of course, Sandia Labs is in Albuquerque, or in Santa Fe, and is set up to continue to create new nuclear weapons, better nuclear weapons. $60 billion a year is being spent on building new pits. That's the core of a nuclear weapon. It's insane, and we've got to stop doing it.
And I think that what you are doing is valuable here, and I hope that this book gets circulation among important people and regular people as well. Even though I am I don't have a optimistic view of what is possible in the U.S. right now, because you look at history and this empire, which I think is Western imperialism. The U.S. in basically consolidated Western imperialism under one, national management project after World War II, and it is unassailable in many ways. There's no institutions in the U.S. that can really act to influence power. The main thing that seems to restrain the U.S. in foreign policy is when it has gone so far that to go further would result in potentially catastrophic pushback from other parts of the world. Like the idea of the U.S. public really getting exercised about anything and somehow demanding change doesn't even seem to be in the cards at all. And yet, I think that as the U.S. the position of Western imperialism deteriorates further, and this is a centuries-long thing that is now unraveling, so it's not surprising that these people wouldn't understand that it's possible for Western imperialism to end. But as this happens, is the hope that this will open up more discussions by people who are realists in the sense that you're a realist looking at the actual power in the United States as this politico-economic power?
Social movements that arise and can arise spontaneously over a variety of issues continue to happen. The Occupy movement scared the hell out of the Titans. They demanded the police state infiltrate, discourage, arrest, diminish it as much as possible. And so those kinds of movements where people get an idea and say, okay, it's time for inequality to be discontinued. It's time for wealth to be shared. It's time to break up these capital oligarchy institutions. It could happen. It's a matter of people publicly acclaiming and having ideas of resistance. It can be nonviolent. It can be non-cooperation, and they would fall by the wayside. I really believe that's possible. And so by writing this book and by making that the idea that we can change this a possibility, I think is my contribution to this effort.
Now, I want to get into something that you don't get into in the book, but which I think I know you're so conversant in, so I think it's important to bring up. You talk about these economies of that are harmful that the Titans are engaged in, and they make money off of gambling, liquor, private prisons. And there's one issue that I think is relevant to the way that this oligarchy in the West has developed, especially in the 20th century and beyond. And that is the organized crime aspect, especially drugs. But the precursor to that is really like prohibition. And some of these figures like Lansky and the Syndicate, they are intertwined with intelligence agencies. Lansky has connections to both the U.S. and to Mossad. And Lansky was one of the main figures in terms of actually facilitating and financing and getting weapons for the original people who created the State of Israel, for example. And this drug economy is huge. It's one of the top traded most lucrative international commodities. And Peter Dell Scott writes in one of his books, came out in the early 2000s, that the top 3 international traded commodities are oil, weapons, and illegal drugs. And the illegal drugs seem to be, more than anyone wants to admit, intertwined with intelligence agencies. And they get involved in affairs in the U.S., deep events. They're involved in, like, the JFK assassination has a big drug angle with especially Jack Ruby is the most obvious one. Watergate, the burglars themselves had all kinds of links to the drug traffic. Iran-Contra had a big drug angle, which tied into Afghanistan's drug angle as well with the Mujahideen. 9/11, people seem to be, a lot of them, connected to Western drug trafficking intelligence operations in different ways. I mean, this aspect of it is sort of the secret weapon of these Titans, I think, that they control the underworld of organized crime and the intelligence agencies that have the ability to kill with impunity. So how, even though you don't write about this in the book, I know you're aware of this, how do you conceptualize this dark realm of organized crime and the organized relationship between organized crime and the national security state? Organized, but a weak relationship.
Direct relationship through capital. Yeah. As crime makes money, it goes somewhere. It's put in banks.
Yes.
Or it's invested through these Titan companies. I would imagine a major share of the 50 trillion that they're investing is money that came from illicit activities, from drug trade. And that's got to be a major portion of what they're doing. And I'm sure they know it.
Right. I mean, and it's staggering because
you don't not know where $10 trillion came from of your 50. Of course, it came from the drug trade, or it came from banks that are closely interconnected with allowing capital to be washed and reused.
Yeah, I heard Joe Rogan say this once. I don't watch a ton of Joe Rogan, but sometimes people have clips on there and there was, I don't remember who the guest was, and this was years ago, but he was talking about the drug trade, and he said, stop and think about it, man. And I think maybe he was high because he always smokes weed on the show, or maybe he wasn't, but either way, it makes sense either way. He goes, think about it, man. All that money out there in the drug trade and these big organizations that make it all. Do you think that these, like, these bankers are just going to like let that money, like they're going to say, oh no, we don't want that money. Of course they are involved. And I mean, it was funny because this like stoner mixed martial arts fighting dude, comedian guy is like saying something that's important and true that you really won't hear Western social scientists say. I mean, this seems to be emblematic of the denial we have going on here.
Yeah, right. I hear what you're saying. And of course that money's there. We know the drug trade exists. What was Peter Dale's numbers? They were 500 billion or something. I mean,
there's an American War Machine and Drugs, Oil, and War. He has some different statistics, but there's also the fact that it was written in kind of mainstream publications that one of the only sources of liquidity during the financial crisis, which kept it from being worse, was drug traffic. Organized crime was still, whatever happens, organized crime is still out there earning for the system, and that they were able to keep putting liquidity into the system because they have a good steady source of it, which is all the drugs that they sell to all these people, often, you know, not wealthy people. And this is done on a cash basis. So it doesn't matter if the, you know, I mean, it's a cash trade. It seems like that's the most, and then the fact that these same people would invest in private prisons, they would have the money to invest in private prisons, perhaps with drug profits, so that they could put the criminals in jail for drug trafficking, the criminals, and, you know, in quotation marks. I mean, I have to think that we're getting at an inflection point where the regime in the West is so indefensible. It's like, or you cannot defend it, what it does in the way that it operates, unless you just have enormous blind spots. And is the world waking up to this internationally? Because I think that it is, and I think that's their real weakness, more than what we can accomplish here, is that internationally it just doesn't wash anymore. Do you think that that's the case, or do you think that there's optimism based on what we can do?
We can point this out. We can try to address the issues, and be as open about it as possible. I worry that if we get too accurate, that they may decide that it's time for us to be reversed in some fashion. You and me both. Yeah,
that thought occurs to me as well. Up heretofore, they have not really gone after academics, but also the other aspect of this is that the fascism and the fascist elements seem to emerge more when the crisis is more acute. And I think we're getting to that point, which makes me a little worried, hopeful, but also worried, because what's making me hopeful is what's scaring very powerful people, because we're looking at the same things.
Yeah, you're right. Right. I think writing a book like this, there's always a thought that the people that I'm writing about aren't going to like it. I think that they are in such powerful situations and have so much control over the world that something like this has very little impact on them. And so that's a redeeming safety factor from my perspective. But you know, you have to do what you believe is the right thing to do, and calling out the Titans and saying, stop this, and having 20, 30, 40,000 other people read the book and understand it is, to me, an important piece of trying to make some global change.
I hope so. And I think for the last question I'll ask you is one that's been more on my listeners' minds than especially of late, which is, what is the role of Zionism and U.S. foreign policy as it relates to this management of the global system? Because it does seem that the U.S. has now, you know, tethered itself to a neocon quest for unipolar empire. I think that there was a power struggle in the U.S. establishment over this, but through whatever means, the neoconservatives won, and we embarked on this course after in the 21st century, after 9/11, of global dominance and greater Israel über alles, the ambitions of Netanyahu and these people to control not just Israel, but all the rest of Palestine, maybe even parts of Lebanon. Who knows what they're really going for?
The Middle East.
Hegemony over the Middle East, and who knows what
Exactly.
people like Netanyahu want their borders to be, but not something that the rest of the world is ready to accept. How do you, this ends up being, to my mind, kind of a blood and soil fascist project that doesn't really operate on the basis of the logic of these corporate actors that you point to. And it adds to my mind a level of irrationality and danger to this equation, because the corporate people are perhaps more amenable to like thinking, well, we do actually want to make sure we don't blow up the world. Whereas the neocon unipolar Greater Israel people seem to be motivated by eschatology. And that's something that as social scientists, we have a hard time thinking about that as being a part of the regime. But how do you conceptualize the role of the neocons and ultra-Zionist political actors in the events that we've seen geopolitically in recent decades?
I would equate it with if you had the meanest pit bull in the neighborhood and people were afraid of it and would adjust what they did to avoid it or not antagonize it. That, in a sense, that's what Israel is to the Middle East. And is it
also that way within the U.S. political system?
We arm them with nuclear weapons. So, I'm sorry, what is your question?
Is it not just the biggest, meanest pit bull in the Middle East, but the Israel lobby and the forces associated with it, do they act in a similar way within the U.S. political system? Whereas no one, I mean, that seems to be the way they function.
I think that's an accurate way of understanding it.
And it's Mearsheimer, Paul, writes about the Israel lobby, and I think it even goes further than that. I think that you look at people like Epstein, and they seem to be connected to Israeli intelligence, and maybe the U.S. has outsourced some of these dark institutions that are needed to run the empire. Like, how much of this has to do with how Israel has functioned in recent decades, especially as a part of the U.S. deep state, part of the American deep state. And these are things we don't really know, but I guess the point is that there is this dark side, and Israel and pro-Israel forces seem to have had a bigger part in making the U.S. go off in a more crazy direction than just these Council on Foreign Relations, Wall Street, waspy American imperialists.
I tend to agree with you. It's certainly a dangerous situation that Netanyahu makes even more extreme.
Peter Phillips, where's the best place for people to check out your new book, Titans of Capital?
Well, projectcensored.org is one of the publishers of the book. So I encourage people, if they're going to order it online, to go to projectcensored.org, and Titans of Capital is available. It's also available in your local bookstore.
Very good. Thank you so much, Professor Peter Phillips, for speaking with us today. It was an honor to have you here, and I do give this book a very high recommendation. It's a fantastic and useful book, so everybody should check it out. Thank you again, Peter.
Okay, thank you, Aaron.
As I said in the intro, I made this episode available to everyone to help promote Peter Phillips' important new book, Titans of Capital, How Concentrated Wealth Threatens Humanity. Check the show notes for links to purchase the book. And please do subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. There you will find the best coverage and analysis of the deep politics of the U.S. empire. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. It is also in the show notes, and if you can afford it, we'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe. Thanks to Dana Chavaria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. I'm so happy that we could get Peter Phillips on to talk about Titans of Capital. Peter was an outside reader for my dissertation committee, and he has been a good friend of mine for many years now. He works in the tradition of C. Wright Mills, the great sociologist. Like Mill's concept of the power elite, Peter Phillips' work illuminates the oligarchy that dominates U.S.-led global capitalism. In this way, he's doing his part to expose the actors and interests who benefit from the imperial games being played on the devil's chessboard.